Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house, because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people were crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me." Then the woman, seeing that she could not go unnoticed, came trembling and fell at his feet. In the presence of all the people, she told why she had touched him and how she had been instantly healed. Then he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace." While Jesus was still speaking, someone came from the house of Jairus, the synagogue leader. "Your daughter is dead. Don't bother the teacher anymore." Hearing this, Jesus said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just believe, and she will be healed." The word of the Lord. I like shoes. I have lots of them. I have shoes for walking and hiking and church and kicking around in the yard. I have some comfy house shoes that if I think I can get away with it with my wife not seeing it, go out of the house. I've got shoes that don't fit and shoes that I only wear once in a blue moon. I've even got some shoes I don't like, but I seem to feel I need someday to have them just in case. And the funny thing about shoes is they're not all the same sizes. You can't just go into a shoe store and say, "Give me a 10.5 of that," and walk out, because different styles, different makers, they don't all fit the same way. Now, just like me, I know you've all heard somebody say sometime, "Try walking a mile in my shoes." But I don't have a burning desire to do that. I've heard folks say, "Glad I'm not in their shoes." Well, of course you are. They wouldn't fit, even if they were the right size, because they've been worn down differently. They've got to that point differently, and they just wouldn't feel right on your feet. I'm also not a great fan of "if you could see through my eyes." How could I understand what you're seeing when I was never you? I didn't see anything through your eyes until now. There was no context or no history. I just don't like the implication, either that my shoes are too comfortable for someone else, or my eyes are seeing wrong because they're not seeing what they're seeing. Now, your shoes and eyes are a metaphorical reference to your view on life, but more correctly, your view of life. And a lot of living has gone into getting you the shoes that you're standing in today. The shoes you wear can't be worn by anyone else. There are too many nuanced events in your life, specific interactions, mistakes, triumphs, mysteries in our individual lives to let anyone truly see through our eyes or wear our shoes. And thank God for that, because there isn't one human view of life, one human perspective of events that's more right, better in touch with suffering, or more wronged, that everybody should see that way. Now, I know we've all read and heard sermons on that particular passage before. The two main characters, Jairus and the suffering woman, each rate their own sermon when we examine Christ's ministry in their lives. But let's step back for a moment. Look at this passage as a whole. There's a lot going on there besides the two central themes. Imagine if you were reading this without any background knowledge that came. If you knew nothing of the woman other than what you read there. If you only knew Jairus was a religious leader. What if you had opened a Bible for the first time and this happened to be the story you read? It's a good story, but there's more to it than just the three lead actors, Christ, Jairus, and the woman. There are, by my count, at least 6 possible stories, maybe more, if we really dig into it. And therefore 6 different views of what's going on in this story. All are important. None of them have anything in common, other than Christ being the center of each, the one piece that can't be moved. So let's talk about a couple of them. Let's start with Jairus, a leader of the religious community, a leader in the synagogue. We can safely assume, and by the way, I forgot to do my stopwatch, so if this goes long, it's not my problem. We can safely assume he was well off for the times, probably had a circle of friends that did not include the vast majority of the crowd that he was now in. Indeed, the thought of mixing so closely with this particular crowd was foreign to him. His job was to refute Christ's message, to preserve the law as written. He saw these people during worship service only, and probably no other time. He stood apart from them in his eyes, better than them, morally superior to them, than all those unlearned crowd of sinners. But his daughter was dying. Nothing had helped. He was a rich, respected religious leader, and he was powerless to do anything as his wife and he watched her slowly journey toward death, his daughter. All traditional avenues had been exhausted. What had ever prepared him for the choice he now had in front of him? He could stay at home and continue what he was doing and let nature take its course, or, in desperation, at the bottom of the well, all he could do was humble himself and take the long shot. Perhaps this Jesus Christ could heal her. He had heard the stories, but he had discounted them. He had admonished those who followed this false prophet. He called damnation down on the unbelievers who abandoned the law for this so-called Son of God. But his daughter was dying. Was there anything not worth trying? Any price or humiliation not worth bearing to save his daughter's life? So today, his shoes took him down to the unkempt crowd to beg help from an enemy to his religion. His desperation overcame his pride. Swallowing our pride. We've all been there sometime. But although the crow we ate was the same bitter meal for any of us, the need to do it, what made it necessary, is always different and individual. And so he humbly waited. He fearfully waited. He desperately waited while the master stopped to talk to an unclean woman as his daughter lay dying. He was wearing different shoes that day than he had worn yesterday. And how about the woman? We have no name for her. There were a lot of suffering folk in the Bible, and unfortunately back during those times, most women were not thought of seriously enough to rate a name in a story like this. She had been ill for 12 years. Some translations, when you read it, said she had once been wealthy, but all her money had been spent trying to find a cure. She had lost her husband, her fortune, her home and family. Being unclean, she had no friends and was not welcomed anywhere. She had tried everything that could be done in those days, and nothing worked. She was cursed. Now those are some hard shoes to wear. Those eyes had seen some terrible sights in 12 years, sights no one else could imagine. And now the miracle worker was approaching. Desperation had long since given way to resignation. But here was one last hope. Her problem was different from Jairus. While he was in a crowd that he would normally consider himself to be above all of them, she was approaching a crowd that considered every one of them to be above her. She shouldn't even be out in sight among them. She could be beaten or stoned. But she had heard of the miracles, and her desperation overcame her fear and her resignation. So she crept close to Jesus. Perhaps kept hidden by divine decree, or just unnoticed because the throng was concentrating on the Master. Long shots, Hail Marys, nothing left to lose. A final desperate attempt. We've all been there. We've all had occasion that we had to draw on whatever strength and dignity we had left and face a world that for whatever reason didn't want to see us. But although the odds were just as great, the wager was unique to us. The risks were varied, the reasons too many to mention. But she desperately reached out, wearing different shoes today. Pardon me. The disciples were traveling with Jesus and crowded close as they walked through the cloud. They were a confusing group of men. They had seen miracles performed, but for some reason always seemed amazed when another one happened. They knew Christ wished to speak to the people, but they often tried to keep folks at bay, so Christ constantly had to admonish them. Earlier in Luke, in chapter 7, we see Christ heal a centurion's servant. We see him raise the widow's son from the dead. In chapter 8, he calmed the storm, and he drove demons from the man into the swineherd. The disciples had been there for all those miracles. Their shoes and sight had changed greatly from their previous lives, but they were still influenced by their upbringing, by their background, their mannerisms, and the way they addressed issues and questions. When the ill woman touched Christ and was healed, Jesus immediately asked who touched him. The disciples were amazed. Many people were pressing against you. These were men who had seen miraculous things done walking right next to Christ. And they were amazed that he could tell someone touched him. They still didn't recognize the omniscience and omnipresence that was God in the flesh. That nothing was impossible. Everything was possible. But they missed it, being too close. Not being able to believe that the little things were just as miraculous as the big things. Christ knew who touched him, just as he knew what he was doing when he raised people from the dead. Maybe if we had been with the disciples, we would have seen clearer, but I doubt it. Being that close to real power tends to make you be amazed at everything. Now for me, the person I emphasize most with in this passage is in verse 49. That's the someone who came from Jairus' house with the terrible news, your daughter is dead. Don't trouble the master anymore. Doesn't say it was a servant or a slave, just someone. Could have been a relative. You don't know. It's just one sentence. But what terrible shoes were those to wear that day? When I was in the Marine Corps, I had to perform casualty assistance and counseling officer duty 9 times. Notifying the next of kin in person of the loss of a husband, a father, a brother, a son, and once a daughter. Those shoes never fit. Those kind of shoes never feel right. There are folks here who have had to do that, maybe more than a few. You never want to pull those shoes out and put them on, but you have to. Or maybe you remember the face of someone who had to give you that news. One line, no name, someone came. Then you have the mother who's at home. She's watched her daughter die while her husband is off on what probably to her was a fool's errand. Child is gone, and she's alone in her grief. No one should have to wear those shoes. But every day someone has to. And no pair of those shoes are ever the same. They can't be worn by anyone else. Now the last set of shoes I want to talk about is the crowd. Where do you start? They came to welcome Jesus. They crowded around. Who knows what they expected or how many of them there were? I'm sure some of them hoped to see a healing. I'm sure more than one of them was hoping he would go off on the scribes and Pharisees again because they loved hearing that. They were the common people, but each was different in their own way. They had their own view of life there. They had a general idea of what they expected, but it wasn't what they encountered. They look over, and here comes a leader of the synagogue, waiting with them, among them, patiently waiting to see Jesus. His daughter's dying, but he's waiting here with us. What's up with that? Over there is an unclean woman. She actually mingled with the crowd. She was here with us and dared to touch the master, and he's asking for her, and she's healed. What's up with that? When did that happen? The disciples didn't know what happened. They were her hand-picked entourage. What are they doing there? How did they miss it? And then the announcement came that Jairus' daughter was died, but Christ said, believe, and she'll be healed. Who was where in the crowd and heard some or all of this? Who was too far away and heard none, only the shouts and accusations repeated? Everyone will have a different story of what happened. And each story, in their own way, will be true, but different. One of the events will seem more important to some, something different to another. Some won't know what to make of any of it, and others will want to explain every bit of it as if they understood it all. Excuse me. Whose shoes are we in that crowd? Who do we want to be? Whose eyes do we want to look through to get the real messages out of what we read? It's a trick question, because you can look around each other and know most of us have all been in some of those shoes, or even all of them, sometime in our life. Those of us who haven't been, you will be. In my spiritual life, I have been all over the shoe store. And to tell you the truth, I still get lost in it sometimes. I often miss the obvious, frequently focus on the trivial. I'm often sure I'm right, right up to the point it's unmistakably clear that I'm wrong, and perhaps even a little bit longer. And it's because I'm always in the wrong shoes, or I'm trying to be someone else in someone else's shoes, and they just don't fit right. The only shoes we should strive to be in are that one piece that can't be moved, Christ. But they're hard shoes to wear at first. Now let's think about how that all ended up with all those sad stories in that. Jairus' daughter was brought back to life. The woman was healed. Those two we know. The crowd saw amazing things and would go forth to spread more word. The disciples, as thick-headed as they seem sometimes, continued to be trained with these type of teachings and became apostles and Christianized the known world. And my favorite is that person from verse 49 who delivered that terrible news now had that burden lifted from them, because that daughter that they had just announced was dead was now brought to life. We can't be hurt too much or saved too much. Blessings are collateral damage until they turn into real blessings. The big blessing for you is a waterfall that you're standing under and absorbing and loving every minute of it. The little blessing is the people who are around the edges of your life who are getting damp from that same blessing, knowing that you're happy and safe and wonderful or have gotten what you asked for. Now, I probably shouldn't pick this example, but if I was in Greenbow, Alabama, I wouldn't. But think Forrest Gump. For those of you who are too young to know that movie, I'm sorry. For those of you who are too old and don't like it, I'm sorry, because I like it. But he had trouble walking. He got picked on his whole life when he was young. Life wasn't a rose garden for him. He put on some corrective shoes, and before long he was running ahead of the crowd. He taught Elvis to dance. He was a star for the Crimson Tide. Run, Forrest, run. Finally got the right shoes. Magic shoes. Although that's fiction, that's what those shoes are for us spiritually when we get them. So having been all around the shoe store and back, there's a couple things I want you to consider. Look at your spiritual shoes, and those are the people you meet all day long and all week through your life. None of them are the same. Don't expect them to be. Learn to help, not compare, judge, or criticize the shoes someone else is wearing. You don't know where those shoes have been or what they had to walk through to get to where they are. And keep trying on those Christ sandals. I sent a thing out on Facebook today. I was sitting going over this morning before I came, and a buddy of mine, his name is Chris Merrill, he's a Chief Warrant Officer 4 Aircraft Maintenance Officer in the Marine Corps right now, out in California. He's one of those guys who's built like he could be an extra in an Arnold Schwarzenegger movie. And he had sent on Facebook that he had taken Little Man, which is what he calls his son, to his Taekwondo class, and walked across the street to a restaurant and was having a beer at the bar. And there were two folks next to him having a beer. One was a very skinny young man, and another was a young lady. He was listening to their conversation, and this young man was just talking about his last marathon that he did and how good he did it, how he had trained and everything he had gone through to get there. And this young lady was just telling him how proud she was of him, and it was wonderful. And Chris said he sat there thinking, well, yeah, you're skinny, you can run. You know, I don't believe it's all that big a deal. He wasn't that impressed with him. And the young lady got up and left. A few minutes later, the young man paid his bill, and he got up to leave to go to the restroom. And from underneath his stool, he pulled out his cane and unfolded it and got led away to the restroom. He was blind. And Chris said that taught him something. He was judging that young man sitting there without knowing anything about that young man. And how foolish did he feel to now know that it was a blind young man who was talking about running a marathon. And how great did I feel that I thought God was giving me a message by having that posted this morning for me to read before I came here. So keep trying on those sandals. They'll get comfortable. They're never going to be the only shoes we ever wear because none of us are going to be able to rise to Christ's level. But the glory is in us trying to. And the number of folks who will want you to show them how you got those sandals will be amazing. Because in God's grace, there's a pair for all of us. Amen.